guys, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm working on this little watercolor piece, and I specifically wanted this one to have a few different things in my process. I've been feeling really stagnant with what I'm doing, and that is allowing me to feel very uninterested in each piece that I'm doing. So I really want to freshen that up and find the best way to solve some of the things that I've been less happy with in my own watercolor so that I can make them the best I can. And like they say, a change is as good as a rest, and I'm feeling like I really just need reinvigorated with the way that I work on my art and how I attack some of the problems. So the first thing that I made a change with is actually the surface that I am painting on. I'm using a watercolor board, which I really loved. I loved some of the things that it solved, and the process just felt so much fresher for me. And maybe it's just because it is new and it's different, but I really loved it. So one of the biggest benefits of it is the fact that it's so thick and rigid is that I don't have to tape it down. It's basically its own board and watercolor paper. And the reason that that's so great is because it doesn't buckle the second I put watercolor on it. So for normal pieces of paper, I tape it down on the edges and it holds it relatively flat, but the more washes I do, the more warped it gets, and the larger it is, the more warped it also gets. And this, I end up putting a pretty good amount of watercolor, especially on the background, and it took it really well. It just has like the gentlest of curves in it, but it's just one curve. But it was just really nice to be able to keep putting watercolors on there and not deal with that very frustrating element of watercolor paper. The one downside is that because it's so thick, I can't use it with a light box anymore. And the biggest benefit with a light box, as probably most of you know, is that it keeps the paper very, very clean and it allows me to get a very detailed sketch elsewhere. And for this one, for the process that I used to transfer it today, I ended up doing basically where you color on the back of your sketch and then you press on the front of it, and then it'll transfer that scribbling on the back of the paper onto the surface. And I used my cool erase pencils so that it would be as non-smudgy, smeary as possible. And it did work. I went with a blue so it wasn't just a straight black, but in the future, if I do end up really utilizing this kind of a board, I think that I'll definitely have to look into getting a projector that'll project my sketch onto it, and then I can trace it from there. That way I can keep it as pristine as possible. I don't think I would really want to go back to this method for really detailed pieces. This is actually the method that I used in high school when I was transferring things over, and that was my beginnings. And there was a lot of frustrations that came with it because it's sometimes hard to tell what areas you've already gone over, and for even this very simple one, there were some places in the sketch that I missed transferring over. So moving forward, again, I'd like to look into different options of transferring the sketch over. But a huge benefit, which really just comes down to the specific tooth and type that this board is, but it did have a lot smoother of a surface, which I really loved. It made so that when I was going in with my micron pens and I was doing the line work, it was so incredibly crisp. I loved the look of it. It was kind of a blast from the past in a way, because when I was first really getting into traditional micron line work, I was using Bristol board, which, if you don't know, was very smooth. So I was able to get very crisp things. But with watercolor, where it's very toothy, it's a lot harder to get to that point. And ultimately, in some ways, it's kind of impossible by virtue of the fact that the paper itself is always going to be bumpy. So of course the line's going to be vertically bumpy, but it was just a pleasure to work with this one. And I will actually link specifically to what type of board I'm using. I'm pretty sure it's Canson. I just don't know exactly what kind it is, but it was nice. I will say that I have been missing working on smoother surfaces, and I didn't really realize how much until I was working on this one. So the next big change that I made for this is I wanted to try a technique that I, again, have seen several other artists that I love doing it, and that's where they go in and do the values first with what I assume is a waterproof ink. That's what I used because I did want it so that as I layered more color on top, it would stay budge proof basically. But I have seen other artists do this where they'll take basically a black ink and they'll dilute it and they'll get all their values in, and then they use glazes of color on top to achieve that final colorized version. And that is something that I really have been feeling I've been lacking in as far as my watercolors, and that's a good value range and a good handle on how I'm achieving that. I feel like I'm just not getting things as dark as I want, and I don't want or I'm not getting the shadows as dark as I'd like. And this is a solution that I hoped would solve all that. And in some ways it did, and in some ways it didn't. So the biggest downside, and I knew going into this it would be something that I was really iffy on, but it's that when you do everything as far as the shadows like this and grays, by virtue, everything on top of it is going to be desaturated to a certain degree. And I really love having very saturated pieces, and I love having a lot of variation within the colors of the shadows and the highlights. So knowing from the very beginning I would be limiting the color variation and the saturation that I could get from this piece was something that I feel like is actually probably going to be the biggest reason why I won't continue this process in the future. But it was really, as far as the painting process, it was incredibly enjoyable just to sit down and paint the values. It was therapeutic and pleasant. I wasn't bouncing from one section to the next. I was able to just kind of dig in and enjoy it and get things where I wanted it to. But I think that maybe I'll look into a few different options where I may use basically the same concept, but instead use, say, a waterproof blue ink that I can use where things will be cool colored, and maybe a orange or a red for areas that I know I want to have more of a warm shadow. And that might solve this really desaturated look, and it might have all of the solutions that I'm looking for. Of course, it does have the downside of it being where I have to make sure that it's still dark enough, but also has enough color. And, you know, there's always things to work around and figure out. But I think that that's something that I'd like to go down that path, is to explore this a little bit more and see where I can take it as far as doing the values first and then the color on top. But actually, I do have one more downside for this watercolor board. And I was very surprised by this because it takes a lot of layers of watercolor, a lot of water, and it doesn't buckle and it doesn't get deteriorated. It doesn't have that really worn down look that some watercolor papers can get when you put too much on it. But if you scrub at this, it will ruin the surface. And I was shocked because other paper that I use that technique to be able to lift up a certain amount of color. My arches, I pretty much have never had a problem with that. I can really dig at that paper with, usually what I do is I take my my paper towel, and I soak it in water, and then that allows me to dab at the paper and remove paint that I need to or whatever. But for this board, I actually got a little smudge on it. I think my cat stepped on it, but I went in and I dabbed it up and I got the color removed, which in hindsight, it would have been better to have left the color, but I didn't know this yet. So I got the color removed and I couldn't see any Mars in the surface of the paper, but as I was working on it, it remained. It absorbed the paint a little bit differently than everywhere else, and you could see that the texture of the paper was just a little bit different. So I was surprised. It does mean that, again, certain things that I'm really used to being able to do and being able to control in that way would be off limits on this paper. So it would take a little bit of getting used to not automatically go there or to not allow myself to do that. Of course, I could still dab at it gently. So sometimes when I like to get more of a gradient that fades off into nothing, I will dab at the end of it to really just feather it out. And I think that would still be good. You just don't want to scrub at it. And then I finally got to my favorite step, and that's where I get to go in with my metallic paints. And this time I actually got a set of a variety of colors from Cintiq, so it's still the same brand as the other colors that I have used. And I'll have the whole palette listed down below in my description as well. But it was really very fun, especially on the smoother paper. I have noticed is that the Cintiqs shine just so much better on a smooth surface. the light hits it all together at once and it shines. So I was a lot more pleased with the process of using it on this particular paper than I normally am, and I'm normally very happy with it. So I loved the process of that, and I loved including it, and this piece just looks really shiny, and I like that. And that is it for today. I do have this little painting available at my art shop. There's a link down in the description, right at the top actually, and there's also a link to my Patreon. And I promise as soon as I get back from the Denver Comic-Con, which I'm at currently, I will give you guys over at Patreon lots of little goodies and a lot of content. I want to make up for this empty week and the weeks before that where I was preparing for convention. But yes, that is about it for today. I will be back next Wednesday with another video. And again, I have a link to all of the tools that I used to create this painting down in the description. But that's it. So I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then.